Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful once again that we can open your word together, that we can examine the foundation of Adventism and of this movement. And we're thankful, Lord, for the way that you work in our lives, the conviction that you bring us, and the strength that you provide through your Holy Spirit to walk a Christian life. And we ask, Lord, that we can continue to see our need of you, to see our sins, to confess them and forsake them, and to reflect your character in all that we do and say. We ask for your presence here this morning through thy Spirit, that you can speak to our hearts and minds, that you can give us a clear understanding, and that you can help us to sort through the rubbish to find these precious jewels. Be with us all now. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So, good morning again, everyone. And we're continuing this study into the daily. And more specifically, right now, we're going to be addressing the commencement of the 1335. Yesterday, we had drawn on the board the 1335 and the 666 years, and how Miller had laid out this history. And we could see that the daily isn't just pagan Rome, as it's sort of portrayed by Heidi Hikes and others, that the daily includes all of paganism, at least from 723 BC. So it would include Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, as well as pagan Rome. And that on the 1850 chart, they're going to count 965 years from 457 to 508. And they're counting just that part of the daily that is part of the 2300 days. So it doesn't mean that the daily begins in 457. Or does the daily just begin in 158 BC with the league between the Jews and the Romans? It has to go back earlier in order for Daniel chapter 8 to make sense, especially in connection with the question of how long shall be the vision concerning the daily. So we know that this 508 date, and Stephen's going to present some on this, is one of those things when you ask people, even in this movement, what event in 508 marks the taking away of the daily? We're going to get some people who are not going to even be able to give an answer. And then we're also going to get different answers. So what would be an answer of what occurs in 508? What event marks the taking away of the daily? Anyone?
Okay, there could be some that would assume that this might have an impact based upon the baptism of Clovis. There could be some that would say that there would be other historical events.
Okay. Yeah, so there's a lot that happens in 508, and depending on who we're discussing with, or what kind of question we're facing, sometimes we give different answers, and I've seen different answers within this movement. Now I'm just going to show you. I just put together a document here that's just copy and paste, nothing fancy, but this is a letter from Charles Fitch. Charles Fitch is the one who died just before October 22nd, 1844. I don't know if anybody remembers, because of getting pneumonia, baptizing people in the cold. That's at least what they say about it. Exactly what those conditions were, I don't know. Charles Fitch is interesting too, because he was also a friend of Charles Finney. I don't know if people know who Charles Finney is, but he was a did systematic theology and wrote some pretty powerful books about overcoming sin. But anyway, they were friends, and Charles Fitch was a minister. And he came to accept Miller's understanding of things, right? He obviously became a Millerite, but he's going to ask this question. So he was a pastor at an Orthodox Congregational church, right? And he had started reading Miller's works, and he's going to have a question. So he has a number of questions, but this is the first question is the one that I'm interested in. It says, will you have the kindness to inform me by letter in what history you find the fact stated that the last of the 10 kings was baptized in AD 508? And also that the decree of Justinian, giving the Bishop of Rome power to suppress the reading of the scriptures, was issued in 538. So why would Fitch be asking these questions?
You mean beside the fact that he would be looking to have a greater understanding? I mean, that's
Right,
kind of
beside
a
that
big
fact.
question.
So, but he's asking these specific questions. So what would we imply from this? Because he wants to know these particular points for these dates, and what could we?
What would we assume from this?
Yeah,
That he's looking for some kind of a starting point.
right. And so he wants to know what event is the starting point in 508. And so in his mind, it would be about the last of the 10 kings being baptized in 508. The conversion of the pagan kings is one of the early arguments that Miller uses for 508. Okay, so now have we ever used that argument? Do we talk about the conversion of the 10 pagan kings? Have you ever heard that? That the last king is baptized in 508. Has anybody here heard that?
That's what Jeff used to say.
Okay. So
I've
Jeff,
heard
What's that?
that it was seven kings were
7
baptized.
kings? Okay.
Yes, and then the other 3 kings were uprooted.
The other 3 kings what? Were uprooted. Okay.
Yeah, plucked up.
Okay, plucked up. Yeah. Okay, so, but as far as, yeah, so the last of the 10 kings is baptized in 508. I've never actually heard that one personally, so Jeff may have said it. I would always look at it as the uprooting of the kings. That was my understanding. Sometimes we'd hear the conversion of Clovis in 508, but Gregory of Tours has 496 for the baptism of Clovis. And we're going to look at that in a minute. So Stephen's going to address this point of what he found. So just kind of explain what it is you found and what you think about it. And do you need to show any documents or anything, Stephen?
I can't really do that.
Okay.
You'd have to do that, but well,
I do have the document you sent me. I could,
right, okay.
if you want me to put that up.
Well, you could do, yes.
Yeah, so would it be the one dating the baptism of Clovis, the Bishop of Vienna versus the Bishop of Tours, or would it be the other document you want me to bring up?
We'll bring up the Word document first.
Okay. So. Okay, just hang on a second. Okay, make this bigger. Okay, so this is your document here.
Yes.
Okay.
So the first section is basically what you get from Encyclopedia Britannica. And it's going to go with the Gregory of Tours initially as being 496.
Mm-hmm.
But then it's going to have another, just mentions the Visigoths there, but halfway through in 507, the battle which the Franks defeat the Visigoths.
Mhm.
And then says a recent analysis of the contemporary sources that describe his reign, especially of a letter written by Avitus of Vienne or Vienna, congratulating him on his baptism, suggests that Clovis did not convert to Catholicism directly from paganism. Prior to accepting Catholicism, he was interested in the Christian heresy Arianism, sympathetic with it, and perhaps even leaning towards adopting it. According to Avitus, it is also likely that Clovis was baptized late in life, possibly at Christmas in 508, only 3 years before his death.
Okay,
So
there's some interesting points there. Go on.
yes, so the key person who seems to be a historian who has come up with this here discovery, I think it was around 1998, she wrote about it.
Mhm.
So it's fairly recent.
Mhm.
And it has there a Wikipedia quote says, Clovis, this is just what Wikipedia seems to have now, it depends what a site you're looking at. There's one site of Wikipedia that will give 496, but when you actually go to looking at Clovis himself
Yeah.
as a subject, it will say Clovis is also significant due to his conversion to Catholicism in 496, largely at the behest of his wife Clotilda, who would later be venerated as a saint for this act. So it's noting his conversion, but it's not saying about his baptism. That's what they're saying here. Celebrated today in the Roman Catholic Church, Eastern Orthodox Church as well. So Clovis was baptized on Christmas Day in 508. And it gives us reference of this here lady here, Danuta Shanzir. She's American.
Mhm.
And so I looked up a wee bit about her. She's just very much into medieval history, and she teaches in various Oxford and other colleges she's taught at. So then I have just here a wee bit about this here letter that she's getting this information, why she's bringing this here 508 date. She says, immediately after baptism of Clovis, received a letter, enthusiastic welcome into the fold. So this here, Avitus, he was the Bishop of Vienna and the most eminent ecclesiastic of the Burgundian kingdom. So just telling you a wee bit about Avitus in this here letter. Now, there's I take it, he's probably an Adventist, this here person called Frank Hardy.
Frank Hardy's an Adventist, yeah. And I sent you his paper too. I don't know if you had seen it beforehand, but.
Yes, I had, yeah. So he's picked up in this here, and he's connecting it with the prophecy of Daniel chapter 12, the 1290.
Yeah.
So he says, Gregory had theological reasons for wanting to tell the story in a certain way. It's important to Gregory that Clovis' conversion and baptism be placed before his famous battle with the Visigoths in 507, which pushed them out of Gaul and confined them to Spain. Gregory wanted to portray Clovis as having theological motives for fighting, and more specifically anti-Arian motives. And then he makes this quote, his efforts to make Clovis's decision in favor of Christianity seem personal, and to link it to God directs an intervention in a desperate military situation are strongly reminiscent of legendary themes. So they sort of have this your idea of, he wants to portray Clovis as being like Constantine, where he's like a pagan, and then God, he gets like this here sign from God or victory,
Yeah.
or sort of sign, and then he was going to conquer, and
Mhm.
God comes through, so
Yeah.
he's going to be converted then and baptized. So this your person Gregory, he's writing over 50 years after Clovis has died, about that event. And this here woman, Shanzir, she's looked at some of his other dates. He's very much all over the place
Yeah.
with some of his dates. So
Well,
he's
he
not
doesn't.
really reliable.
Yeah, especially with the date that Clovis dies, he basically gives all kinds of different dates for it.
Yes.
So he doesn't seem to have really personal knowledge. It's just sort of
Mhm.
he's just using him for political means
Mhm.
in that sense. Now, have you thought about what this means? Do you have any conclusions what you think this means?
Well, I think this is marking the daily being taken away. This is the beginning where you have a pagan, or like a king anyway.
Yeah.
Maybe he was toying with Arianism for a while, and this is a time now when he's deciding more firmly that he's going to opt for the Roman Catholic Church. And through his personal influence, there's going to be like 3,000 or so other people of his army baptized pretty soon after that, if not even that same day. I'm not too sure.
Yeah.
And then he's going to influence the whole kingdom of the Franks, the other Frankish kingdoms
Mm-hmm.
as well. And that really just gets the ball rolling for having a power that's going to
Yeah.
decide for the Roman Catholicism to
Yeah.
act on their behalf.
So now, what about the idea that we have an event that we're going to move a date of an event, the baptism of Clovis, from 496 to 508. So we're going to move it 12 years later. Is there any significance in doing that? I mean, because we're examining the foundation, we accept 508, but now all of a sudden we're going to see one of the dates that we had, 496, seems to have been attacked. And how would you look at that? And this is not just for Stephen, but for anyone. But Stephen can answer first if he has any thoughts on it.
Well, I think it's just seems to be more a credible date given the evidence,
Okay.
the historical evidence. I think Alfredus, even though he's sort of like a pompous type bishop,
Mm-hmm.
and but it seems to be more relevant to that time period.
Okay.
That he, it's still not. It's kind of maybe a bit of speculation involved with it, but it does seem to be a bit more inclusive anyway. I think it's a bit more reliable evidence than Gregory of Tours.
Yeah. Okay. And it definitely fits in with what we've been looking at with December 25th. And why would it being December 25th and 508? Why would that be significant for us?
Well, we've connected the fall of the Soviet Union to the 25th of December.
Okay. So we have the fall of the Soviet Union, the 25th of December. And how would that connect then with 508?
The
Essentially
taking away
have,
of paganism.
yeah,
Okay, so the taking away of paganism And this would be an attack on atheism, which really they're related in some ways. Right? Now, a question's asked by Jeff here. Why wouldn't all of the former countries of pagan Rome be involved in as part in 508 instead of just Clovis? All of Europe converted to Catholicism. So not sure if I fully understand, because we do have, by 508, we have basically all of Europe is now Catholic.
Oh, okay, okay. I see. I thought it was just basing it on Clovis. That's what I thought.
Well, Clovis, what the way that it was understood before is Clovis is the first one,
Right.
and now we're going to see that he's the last one. Because in that period of time from 496 to 508, so you have 3 horns that are uprooted.
Like Clovis, yeah.
Yeah, by Clovis. So Clovis is, of course, the instrument, because it's France that's going to put the Pope on the throne of the earth, the papacy on the throne of earth. And
I disagree.
Stephen disagrees. Why do you disagree still?
I think he's the first.
You think Clovis is the first, you mean?
Yes,
That's
because you have
in 508?
the ones that are going to do the main plugging up. You have the
Okay.
the Herioli. You normally Alaric, I think, was there.
Okay.
Was it Alaric the first was killed? No, it was the Odoacer. Sorry, he was the main king of the Herioli, and he was killed by Theodoric. He was another god. He was a god.
So later on.
And no, 493.
Oh, in 493. Okay.
And so they normally put that there as the plucking up of the Herioli, even though the tribe did continue on for, like, in some form, but that was when Theodoric basically became the king of Italy, taking Odoacer's place.
Okay.
But Theodoric was doing it basically at the behest of Zeno, who was the emperor of Byzantium. And so in a sense, you have Byzantium there, in a sense, making a move, using Theodoric to pluck up the Herioli. And then you have, but I think Theodoric was still pretty pagan around that time. I don't think he was Catholic.
Yeah.
And then you have the Vandals being plucked up in 534 is normally the date given, when you have Belisarius going into North Africa and just defeating the Vandals.
Yeah.
And then with the Ostrogoths, who basically was Theodoric was an Ostrogoth. You have them continuing on, even 538. They're then removed by Belisarius, the Byzantium general, again.
It's not going to be till 538, you're saying?
So that's 538. They're removed from Rome, certainly then. But then they do come back again. They win another battle. There's like a bit of a tussle. And it's only really until 554 until the Ostrogoths are really defeated by the Byzantine forces.
Yeah, because so what did we do with the 3 being plucked up in 508? Because that was generally how it was looked at. So why were we marking 508 in the past?
I think it wasn't that the 3 horns were plucked up in 508.
Okay.
But the previous teaching that I used to, I think Jeff was teaching anyway, you had these here 10 kings take the place of the Western Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had 7 kings convert to Catholicism by 508. And then from that time, then you would have the kings in place, and then the other kings would be uprooted.
Okay, after that time.
Yes.
Okay.
Even though the Herioli, you'd say, is
earlier.
normally put forward you normally do put it earlier, but they still continued. There was another like Harulai king and stuff, whatever. There was battles, but they then eventually fade out a few decades later.
Yeah. So in looking at this history in the past, I was always very confused because you have all different kinds of opinions about 508. Right. So that's part of the problem is some people would say that they were all uprooted by 508, and then some people would put them later on. So it wasn't something that was really clear to me what event that we were taking. And now having Clovis's baptism on Christmas in 508, to me is much more powerful than trying to deal with the 7 kings all being converted.
7 kings could be part of that. You know.
Yeah, well, it would be part of it, but Clovis to me seems to be the key.
Yeah, to solidify that maybe.
Yeah. Because Clovis is the king of the Franks, and it is the French that put the papacy on the throne of the earth. That we would agree on.
Yeah, true.
Because they're going to remove the papacy as well. And then we're going to get Justinian in 538. And it would be more in connection with Justinian's decree that we would see the persecutory power of the papacy being put in place legally. That's the way that I would understand it. But it is a confusing history because when you read, modern scholarship on this history, of course, they're looking at different things and different themes. Now, the one point I want to bring out that has always been a problem is how the Bible addresses prophecy and history compared to how historians look at history. For instance, when do we mark Greece coming into prophetic history?
Maybe 332.
39.
I think the chart has 332 or so.
Okay, yeah, so 332. Okay, so we have 332, which is going to be Alexander the Great, right? But yet Greece existed long before that. So people will look at how we interpret these events. Why would we mark Greece in 332? Well, we would say that they conquered Persia, right? And Persia is the previous king. And even if you go to Persia, Persia exists. Well, they're going to conquer Babylon, right, in 539. And then when we're going to look at Babylon coming into history, what event is we're going to mark Babylon? When does Babylon come into history, prophetic history?
609.
In prophetic history?
When Nebuchadnezzar invades Jerusalem.
Okay. So we
Well,
play 677, right? Now,
That's Manasseh.
the captivity of Manasseh. Well, Babylon at that time is in control by Assyria. It's being controlled by Assyria. And it's Esarhaddon, who his father had destroyed Babylon and then made Esarhaddon king of Babylon. So he gets that as his, inheritance, so to speak. Now he gets his brothers to kill his father, and I think which is Sennacherib, if I remember correctly. I always get these names mixed up. And then of course they're going to be punished for killing their father, so he ends up becoming king. And Esarhaddon's the one who's going to take Manasseh captive and bring him to Babylon. So Babylon really isn't existing as an independent nation at the time that they come into history. And then when we get to Nebuchadnezzar is really what they call the Neo-Babylonian Empire. That is, after Assyria had conquered it and Esarhaddon had rebuilt Babylon, we're going to see that there's going to be later on Babylon is going to rebel against Assyria, and Babylon then once again becomes a nation. And that's going to be under Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar's dad, that they established the Neo-Babylonian Empire. So, but the point is, when a historian would look at this compared to somebody studying Bible prophecy, we're going to be at odds with each other. Now, we see the same sort of thing when it comes to the fall of Turkey. So we have a prophecy that has to deal with the second woe. When is the second woe going to end? And they're going to look at it, well, Turkey is going to fall August 11th, 1840. But it's not going to be really till November 1st, 1920, I think it's 1920 or 1922 or something like that, that you actually have the end of the Turkish Sultanate. So, from a historian's point of view, well, Turkey continues on and on. So we have this problem, and from somebody who's not understanding Bible prophecy, they will look at something like, and we can see an example of this would be Desmond Ford. He will just sort of mockingly say that the papacy didn't dominate. Papal supremacy wasn't 1260 years. There wasn't persecution for 1260 years. There's just, a short period of time where there was persecution. So how would we answer these types of questions? What is it that we see about Bible prophecy that helps us to understand where we mark events? Are we just picking and choosing to make things fit? Because that's the way it would look to somebody who's just a historian.
Well, the Ottoman, their sovereignty was taken away from them in 1840, August 11th.
Well, yeah, in a certain...
When you don't have your sovereignty, you don't make your own laws anymore. You're not much of a nation.
Yeah, well, in a certain sense, but I mean, they still existed as a nation, right? So when we're looking at it from Bible prophecy, what we're looking at is these time periods and the events that God is marking. So we would see that in order for the second woe to end, because Constantine had to yield to the Turkish sultans in 1449, then the end of that period is going to be when the Turkish sultan has to yield to the four European powers. But somebody just who doesn't understand Bible prophecy wouldn't see that date as particularly significant as far as the end of the Ottoman Empire. They would look at other events much more significant, but they're not looking at it through the eye of a prophecy. Now, because when it comes to events, and this is an important point, and it goes back to what Tess was doing when she was what I would call picking and choosing events. It was, when she was dealing with November 9th, 2019, and she was going back and taking these spans of time. And I saw that she wasn't being particularly honest, and maybe is the way to look at it, of what she was picking and choosing and why she was marking these dates and these years. Because one thing is, you could see Tabo, a year later, he did the same thing. I think it was with 2020. He just took exactly the same spans and then just picked and chose events in those years. But they weren't particularly connected. That is, the structure was kind of artificial. And the events that were chosen, there were some that were quite significant, but lots of them were just kind of, there's lots of different events that you could take. And you can pretty much take almost any year and find some event that you can see as significant. Now, the same thing happens with evangelicals who use the 2520 in connection with modern Israel being restored, both in 1948 and 1967. They look at these events and they will take the end period. They'll count 25, 20 years back. Now, they're going to do it different ways. So some are going to use a 360-day year, or different things like that to try to get some event. And then they'll connect it with some date in biblical history. And they will just say, here we have this date, it's 20 years. And that to them seems significant. And that was kind of what Tess was doing from my perspective. But the question is, how is it different what we're doing? What is it that Miller was doing that was different than these types of methods?
Our books in the past has said that we will mark the time when these events have something to do with God's people.
So having to do with God's people, that's when these nations come into history. This is part of it, but there's more to it than that. Why can we as Seventh-day Adventists be certain about the chronology of the 2300 days, the 2520, the 1335, the 1290, the 1260, Revelation 9? What is it about these dates that can make us certain?
Miller just said he consulted the best chronologers that he could find at his time, but he didn't specify anything. I don't think, unless he said something elsewhere in his writings.
Right. So you're going to have different chronologists who are going to have different opinions. I mean, that's one of the things about chronology is you get 10 chronologists in a room and you're going to have 30 different opinions. So what is it that Adventism has over all of the other religions that try to use time prophecies? Whether they're in the past or not, what is it that Adventism has?
Well, the prophetic emphasis we acknowledge is different than the historical emphasis in the the kingdoms of Bible prophecy are not the same as the kingdoms of world history.
But I'm not really asking that question. I'm asking, why do we know that our understanding of the time prophecies is correct? And what is the difference that we can see from what Adventism has to offer compared to what everyone else has to offer? Now, I've looked at everyone else pretty much. I've looked at Jehovah's Witnesses. I understand their understanding, even Shepherd's Rod and the Branch Davidians. I've looked at, almost everything that exists out there, all kinds of crazy ideas about chronology. But what is it that Adventism has that other people don't?
The spirit of prophecy is helpful.
Okay, but that's still not the question. Yeah, we have the spirit of prophecy, but that could become a circular argument. Obviously, we have the spirit of prophecy. But there's something about our understanding of prophecy that is different. Now, this is, a lot of this has to do with my study of prophecy, because when I first became an Adventist, and I've told this story many times, the first book I read was Kingdom of the Cults by Walter Martin. Kingdom of the Cults really clearly shows that if Adventism is going to stand or fall as a religion, it stands or falls based upon 457 BC. And this is a controverted point. As much as Adventist scholars and pastors and evangelists, who are going to try to support the 2300 days, because they don't all do that now. But if they're going to, and they're going to support 457 BC, they're going to overstate the case. That is, they're going to try to place 457 BC almost as if it's uncontroverted, right? But we know that it is. That is, 457 BC is not something that you can just go to Wikipedia and you're going to find, everybody agrees. You're not going to go to the internet and find that everybody agrees. So what is it that Adventism has? They may not know they have it, but what is it that we have that is different? And it's pretty much been abandoned by Adventism.
I'm thinking of S.S. Snow's 5 points. Was his approach unique from the rest of the evangelical churches?
Okay, so part of it is that, but we could say it's the typology and its connection to the feasts. So when we look at Adventism and we start to look at our understanding of prophecy, one is it's comprehensive. That is, it ties everything together. It's not just a single line of prophecy. It's line upon line of prophecy. And the sanctuary message is the thing that's unique to Adventism. And we can see that in Snow's presentation, because he picks up on what Miller had done back in 43 regarding the 7th month, and he expands upon it. He starts to tie the spring types and the fall types together. That, Christ came fulfilled the spring types, and that we're now fulfilling the fall types. So Adventism has this complete comprehensive view of prophecy. Now, when we're going to look at something like 508, this is one of the dates that Miller was given, right? So I'm going to go to, thanks, Stephen, for that short study there. And we do have the other document where he gets that history. And I'll email those to people so that they can have those documents. But we're going to go and look at some things that we know quite well. So I had looked at this question. So one of the questions was asking about the baptism of the 10 kings. So obviously he would be referring to 7 kings. So at this time, Charles Fitch isn't completely understanding all of Miller's arguments. But we now can say that on Christmas Day in 508, we're going to have Clovis's baptism. And that's going to be, I think, for us, we would have to take that as the key event in 508, is Clovis's baptism. I mean, it's all tied up with other things. But if you wanted to have a solid date, I don't think you could have something that's more significantly solid than Clovis being baptized in 508. Would people agree with me on that?
Yeah.
So that would be very, very powerful. Now, we're just going to go back, and we've all read this. This is from Sylvester Bliss's book. From a further study of the scriptures, I concluded that the 7 times of Gentile supremacy must commence when the Jews ceased to be an independent nation at the captivity of Manasseh, which the best chronologers assign to BC 677. Now, even when you look at something that Miller is saying here, I wouldn't agree with him that 677 is the point where Judah, or the Jews, ceases to be an independent nation. They were already under Assyria prior to that, in some ways, but even at this time that they're under Assyria in 677, they're not always going to be under Assyria, and they were also at different times in subjection to Egypt. So Judah at this time is not really. I don't know how you could say 677 means it's not an independent nation and that it never again becomes an independent nation. But that's sort of the argument that he makes. But I would agree with him on 677, just not necessarily his reason for it. That the 2300 days commenced with the 70 weeks, which the best chronologers dated from BC 457, and that the 1335 days, commencing with the taking away of the daily and the setting up of the abomination that maketh desolate, were to be dated from the setting up of the papal supremacy after the taking away of the pagan abominations, and which, according to the best historians I could consult, should be dated from about AD 508. So even here, he just has about AD 508. He doesn't have a really specific event. Now he says, reckoning all these periods from the several dates assigned by the best chronologers for the events from which they should evidently be reckoned, they would all terminate together about AD 1843. Right? So he says, I was thus brought in 1818 at the close of my 2 years study of the scriptures to the solemn conclusion that in about 25 years from that time, all the affairs of our present state would be wound up, right? So we're going to see that he's got these 3 commencement periods. And we know that Ellen White says that Miller was given the commencement of the chain of truth. And we can see that there are 3 dates. And these are the 3 main prophecies that the Millerites had. Even though they have the 1260 days, they have 3 prophecies that end in 1843.
Millerites always remain tentative, even after 1844. He's saying, we're still in the ballpark. This, Jesus could come at any still. So he kept a window open in his mind that the other Millerites did not really stick with.
Yeah, but we
They
know that
pressured him to set a definite time.
Right. But he should have, after October 22nd, recognized that that was a fulfillment of prophecy. Instead, he abandoned the 7th month movement. So Miller was open to be corrected, which is a good thing. But once they had experienced the fulfillment of prophecy, he should have accepted it. He should have recognized that the Millerite movement was a fulfillment of prophecy. And this brings us to another point. One of the things about our history and our understanding of prophecy is that Adventism became a part of the prophecy. That is, other people may be able to look at prophetic periods either in the future or in the past, but it wasn't something that they predicted and then they saw fulfilled. And Adventism has that unique experience of predicting, for instance, the fall of the Ottoman Empire and experiencing it, and also the end of the 2300 days and the 1335 and the 2520, and experiencing that fulfillment of prophecy. So that's another thing that Adventism has that other groups do not have. And they're fulfilled in a way that is comprehensive, that unlocks the past, that it helps us to see that the light of the past was solid. It gives an explanation for everything. That's the thing about Adventism that intrigued me, because I'm very familiar with lots of other religions, but they weren't comprehensive in that way. Adventism was. And the more it's examined, the more we see, the more comprehensive it becomes. Adventism isn't just some offshoot of Christianity, some church that just split off from some other church. It was a huge movement that came from all these different denominations and formed into a worldwide denomination directed by God that was a fulfillment of prophecy. Can we say the same thing about our movement? Not that it came from all different denominations so much, but that our movement is a reiteration of those principles that occurred in Millerite history. That is, our disappointment, July 18th, 2020. Can we see that it was a fulfillment of prophecy? And if so, why would we argue that it was? What is it about our fulfillment of prophecy that parallels Millerite history?
I've always struggled with the idea of the movement itself fulfilling a prophetic pattern. I considered it kind of too much navel gazing on our part.
Well, if it's not, then I don't see any reason why you would be in the movement.
Yes, I've tried to keep this movement on the big line.
Well, but the movement is not on the big line.
Yeah, so we see, so we say now. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it never
So
was.
I struggled with that when Jeff first proposed it.
That the movement was the big line.
No, that the movement was not on the big line.
Okay.
I wondered about that when he first proposed it, but I don't remember when it was he said that, first said that.
I don't know. I've never taken that the movement was on the big line. Well, definitely by 2014, we already saw that the movement wasn't on the big line. But I would still think that once we got,
I guess at 9/11 we began to depart from
yeah, that's what I'm
Adventist
saying.
theology.
Well, I don't Adventist theology in 9/11.
Well, that's not the right term.
No, I mean, definitely by 9/11, we should have seen that this movement was not the big line, because that's what 9/11 actually shows us, that it's a movement to reform Adventism, but we didn't really develop it until at least by 2014, that we started to understand, because what Jeff started to see is that, and we're going to see this when we get further, because this is a study about the foundations of this message. And we're going to see why this is important and how this connects to the daily, the issue of the daily. So we may seem to be being a bit scattered here, but we're not. This is quite purposeful and where we're wanting to look. So what they saw that is in Millerite history, that there was two groups, Protestants and Millerites, and that there was a midnight cry that happened before April 19th, what they believed was the midnight cry. But that after their first disappointment, they had then what was called the true midnight cry. And Jeff started to see that that was happening in this movement, that this movement wasn't representing this big line that we might have thought that it was, because especially in the 90s, we're just looking at a movement within Adventism to reform Adventism to prepare them for the Sunday law. But after 9/11, the movement is kind of lost for a little bit in trying to sort through what had just happened. Where do we place 9/11? And as we start to reconcile all of these things, it becomes clear that there is this separate movement that isn't just Adventism. Now, it starts going off track where it starts to get with Parminder and Tabo, this idea that we're going to start this new church. And Jeff even picks up on that idea, which I think which is wrong.
Was that when he came up with the 4 anointings of David? Was that like 2014? King Saul was dead, and so the mantle was passed to our group because Adventism was dead. You know that study, the 4 anointings of David.
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of connected, but that's not really where he gets that from. But yeah, what we start getting into is where this movement is going to become a church, which I always believed was wrong, because this movement, and as we look at the foundation, it was built upon the idea that it's a reform movement within Adventism to reform Adventism, not the organizational structure, but the members. Now we had
That's the way I thought of it too.
Yeah, so when we have the priests and the Levites, the idea is that this movement is developed to give a message to the Levites. And those Levites are Seventh-day Adventists. And so this idea that we were going to get a new name, this new church, and Tabo was really pushing that here in Canada. and probably other places, I didn't accept because I'm a Seventh-day Adventist.
I struggled with that too.
Yeah. But so getting back onto this point is we know that the message has developed. We can see this with Miller. His understanding of the message isn't static. You know, it's fluid. He continues to receive more and more light. And that's what Jeff was doing. Jeff was receiving this advancing light as we're walking down the path, as we're going through fulfilled prophecy. And we should be able to recognize that this movement fulfilled prophecy. It's quite clear that it did. Now, many people, of course, rejected that because it didn't happen the way that we expected. But we should have expected that it shouldn't have happened the way we expected it to happen, because it didn't happen that way with the Millerites. And so the fact that we repeated Millerite history, to me, was extremely profound and should have automatically had us recognize who we were and when we were. But many people didn't want to recognize that. Now, I think part of it is that we believe that we were on a bigger part of the line than we really were. But we're just Samuel Snow. And Samuel Snow, more specifically, were Samuel Snow's letters. And then we're going to be Samuel Snow himself as a movement. So Samuel Snow's letters have a purpose. That's July 18th, his last letter before midnight, 3 days before midnight. But now we're going to have this bigger role where Samuel Snow writes these letters that are really not noticed by many until after the first disappointment. But even then, it's going to take time, and not until July 21st does he really get to do a major presentation. That's at the Boston Tabernacle. And that's going to be marked in the spirit of prophecy as midway. And then finally, it's going to be empowered at August 15th at Exeter. And those events, Boston and Exeter, are still future for this movement. That is, we're between his last letter, July 18th, and midnight. Now, we have in our line this December 25th. And if we look at what's happening now, if we look at this progression and understanding of truth, and we're going to take this understanding of the daily, and we know that this is extremely significant. This is not some minor point. The daily has lots attached to it, and we're going to see that even more as we go on in this study. But it goes back to Miller's commencement of the chain of truth, to something that's not, he's not got a specific event, a specific date, but we now argue that we do have a specific date for the first time, and that its significance is really recognized by the end of our 777 days. Do you understand what I'm asking? That Miller had an understanding. He was given the commencement of the chain of truth. But is it true that now we can see that commencement much more clearly than Miller could have because of our line of 777 days ending December 25th, 2021?
I would agree.
Okay, so this unfolding of light, we know new light always makes old light shine brighter. It's not going to be a rejection of old light. So is it a rejection of old light to say, well, Clovis wasn't baptized on December 25th, 496. He was baptized December 25th, 508. Would we say that that's removing a landmark?
No, we're just trying to confirm the landmark.
Okay, we're trying to confirm it. Now, can we sometimes be mistaken about a landmark? That if we go and we survey the land, has it ever been done? anybody ever think of any experience where I know lots of personal experiences where a surveyor comes in and you find that a fence line isn't in the right place? Have you ever heard of such a thing?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Now, would that be moving the landmark?
Oh, yeah.
Well, so if you
Well, we would say he's confirming the landmark. It just was
He's
different
confirming
than
it.
what they thought it was.
right, so there was a misunderstanding about, because somebody built a fence, because they hadn't surveyed it or whatever. A friend of mine had this happen. He lost a whole bunch of land because they just built a fence. The neighbors had built a fence, to keep their cows out of that area. And he just assumed, well, that's my land there. But when they actually surveyed it, he lost, quite a few acres of land. So, they had to build a new fence because they had the survey posts there, that they could mark from. But often so the landmark itself wasn't moved, but people's ideas about the landmark might be uncertain. Now, are we still keeping 508? Is that the commencement of the chain of truth? Is that landmark removed by taking the baptism from 496 to 508?
No, that's confirming a landmark.
That's confirming a landmark, right? So there was a misapprehension or a misunderstanding about some of these events, but we can say, no, this is more solid, but also, does it fit our picture better?
Yes, when we confirm it.
Because one is it ties that symbol in a way that's much more meaningful. Now, the baptism of Clovis on December 25th was already meaningful, whether it was in 496 or in 508. But now when we see this in 508, it becomes even more significant. Now, just an interesting mathematical point. The number of days that we can count. So we're going to count the days all the way from, and I got to find it here. Just hang on. I don't know if I misplaced it here. Okay, so when we count all the days from December 25th, 508, of course, that's a Julian date. So this December 25th, 508 is going to be December 27th on the Gregorian calendar, but we're looking at it on the Julian calendar. And then we're going to count the number of days to December 25th, 2021. And that's going to be 552,610 days. Now, one thing that's kind of nice is it's rounded off to the tens. And so in looking at that number, right away I thought, well, maybe I can divide this number by 360. So I'm just going to divide the number by 360. When I do that, and I'm doing this right.
You're not sharing that with us.
No, I know I'm not sharing it with you. Where do I do this here? I'm just trying to see what I have to do. Okay, so the number of days, I think I'm doing this wrong. 5. Let me see here. Okay, that's what I have to do. So I'm going to take the number of days and I'm going to divide it by 365 first. So if I take the number and I divide it by 365, so that's 552,610. So 552,610 days. And I divide it by 365. So I'm not dividing it by 365 and a quarter. I'm dividing it by 365. And I get the number 1514. So if I just looked at the number of years, instead of looking at them as 365 and a quarter or 365.242, I get 514 years. And if I add that to 508, I get the year 2022. Now, so that's going to be a whole year past our date. That is, the number of years based upon the difference between the Gregorian year and this 365 days in a year is exactly 1 year difference of days. I don't know if that makes sense to people. Now, if I take the number then and
You need a logical reason to decide what to add, divide, subtract, or multiply.
well, I do have a logical reason. So 365 days in a year, where does that come from?
That's an astronomical study, right?
Well, it comes from the Mayan calendar. So the Mayan calendar has two different ways to count a year, 360 and 365. Now, I can also take the number of days and divide it by 360. Now, I'm going to get a different number, of course. This number is 1535 years. And it's going to have a couple of days left over, a few days left over. But it's almost exactly 1535 years of prophetic time. Now, the difference between that and the other one is 21 years. So that's a symbol of midnight. And then, of course, the actual number of years is 1513 years, right? So I have 1513, 1514, and 1535. I have these three different ways in which I can divide that number of days and create a year, or how many years it's going to be. Now, my point is that we have this symbol of December 25th. And where else do we mark December 25th?
The fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, so we have the fall of the Soviet Union. So we could look at 2001. And I'm going to do this study a little bit more in detail. I'm going to write it up and show you so that you can see it. But we can mark all of these dates, and we can start to see that there's a structure or a symbolism that exists in the dates. That is, they're all tied to 508 in simple mathematical terms and in different ways. What's that?
You said 2001 for the fall of the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
1991.
that's not what I meant. Yeah, 1991. Yes, thanks. 1991 for the fall of the Soviet Union. I knew I was saying something wrong, but my brain couldn't tell me what it was. Yeah, so you have the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991. And, there's other significant December 25th as well. So we're going to look at some of those. I want to do a study on this December 25th, just more comprehensive than what I'm doing right now. But the point is we can tie these all together. They have a symbolic significance. Now we know that December 25th, 2021 is the 20th day of the 9th month. And that's going to bring us to the story of Ezra in 457 BC. And so the symbol of that date is significant as well. So we're going to look at those things at a certain point, not this week, but a certain point in our studies. I'm going to come to this study of December 25th. Now, the other problem that we're going to face here, I want to go to, back to Heidi Hikes. I don't really want to, but we're going to go back to these other documents. Okay, so I'm going to have to do this way. Okay, so if we go back. I lost my place on this. Okay, I got too many things open. Just hang on. Okay, so this is Heidi Hike's. He has a book called the 508 Source Book. Now he's going to look at this date. He's going to look at Clovis, and he's going to notice the same thing we noticed. He's going to notice 508 is a more solid date for the baptism of Clovis. Now, when he looks at this problem, he's going to quote some stuff dealing with the way that the Millerites understood it and so forth. But he's going to try to undermine with 508, with the baptism of Clovis in 508, as a way of undermining the paganism view of Miller. So he's going to say here in this paragraph, the talk of a war in AD 507 between Clovis and Alaric was authentic as confirmed by the letters sent by Theodoric to Alaric, king of the Visigoths, as well as to Clovis, king of the Franks, as Theodoric was trying to soothe the tensions between the two. The possibility of the war commencing in late 507 exists. However, like the just quoted Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium, the latest in academic scholarship has contested that the Battle of Vogel fought against the Visigoths by Clovis was ultimately in the year 508. The following document dated June 24th, 508 gives strong support for this conclusion. So here we have a person who is undermining the pioneer view of the daily, and he's going to do it in a very careful way by looking like he's supporting 508, but rejecting the paganism argument. So he's going to notice things like these battles, and he's going to prove that the battle is in 508. And then he's going to deal with here in this section with the baptism. I'm just trying to see. There's a lot of stuff. He does a lot of writing. So he's going to, and I probably should have had the page.
Is Hikes really a good historical researcher, or like what we say with Froome stuff, he just copied it?
Well, I don't know. I don't know how much of it is copy. I think he did a lot of research himself, but he's definitely using the arguments of Froome. And I'm going to show you some things too as well. So I may get interrupted here. I might have to do some of this stuff tomorrow because I'm expecting a phone call right away. But so here, I'm just going to type in baptism because I need to get to that point. Okay, so the baptism of Clovis. Anyway, he's going to deal with this. He's going to show the baptism when it is. Okay, that's not going to help me. So what he says, I need to get his words where he's going to talk about the baptism. Okay, I think it's here. Anyway, he argues that even though the baptism is in December 25th in 508, that it doesn't matter. I just got to find where he says this. So he goes and establishes that it's 508, but he thinks it has nothing to do with paganism. And of course, that's a really ridiculous argument. I'm not quite sure. Professor Rose hosted, okay, I think it's in this section, International Historical Conference, which was held in Reims, France, to commemorate the baptism of Clovis. On this occasion, Pope John Paul II was able to meet and talk with historians. So what they were doing is they believed that it was in 1996, 1500 years that France had been Catholic. And they're using the baptism of Clovis in 496 to mark this. So on this occasion, Pope John Paul II, who was the Pope at the time, they gathered with historians, researchers, and scientists to discuss the issue. And they're going to come to the conclusion that it was in 508, right? So on this point, the solemn entry into Tours in 508 after the Battle of Villiers is very significant. The report from Gregory of Tours contains particularly suggestive indications. So they're looking at this as similar to an emperor conquering and coming and having his, I can't remember what they call it, when they come in to a city after they've celebrated, it's a celebration anyway. Their laurels, I guess is what it's called.
His victory march.
Yeah, but I think they call it their laurels, right? If I remember correctly, if that's the term. So anyway, he's going to go through this and show this. 8508, a short time after these events, Clovis received the titles, dignity of Roman Patricius and consul from the Greek Emperor Anastasius. In the same year, he was invested with the diadem and purple robe of the Church of St. Martin at Tours. So anyway, he's going to talk all about this, what ends up happening.
So is this saying that Catholicism itself unclear on what date Clovis became important to them?
Well, they always took 596. So that's the date they celebrated, or 496, pardon me, 496. So 1500 years they celebrated from 496. But when the scholars got together, they said, well, really it's 508. You know, and they didn't say, well, 12 years from now, we should actually have the celebration. But
that's interesting.
Yeah, so the scholars recognized 508, even though the papacy celebrated 496 for the baptism of Clovis. But there's a lot of stuff here. I know I read through all this, but I don't see the part where he mentions why he just thinks it's not important. Okay, he says, in order for the arms of a civil entity, in this case Clovis, to stand or to have allied himself on behalf of another, that is of Catholicism, the legal process must be engaged. Therefore, legal documentation will reveal that just such legislation will be found in the books of the legal code of the day. The documentation will cement the accuracy of the scriptures and the union of church and state that they do so quarterly set up in the year 508. So I can't find the statement. I'm going to have to find it again. But basically, the way that Heidi Hikes approached 508 and 538 is from a legislative point of view. That is, he's not concerned about paganism other than to dismiss it. So he doesn't think that the baptism of Clovis on December 25th has anything to do with paganism coming to an end, right? So he would say, Miller got the right date, 508, but he had the wrong reason. It had nothing to do with paganism. But would we say that Clovis being baptized on 508 would be a good mark to mark the end of paganism? Or would that be wrong?
It has a good deal of logic to it.
Yeah. So, and because we're not looking at things the way that a historian looks at things. We're looking at the way that the Bible looks at things. Now, the transition from paganism to papalism took time. Now, if you're going to take a single event to mark that, what would you use to mark a transition from paganism to papalism? What symbol could we use that's a biblical symbol that would mark that?
I think Jeff said it was a king abdicating his throne, leaving it open in Rome.
Okay, you guys are gonna have to continue.
As Theodore stepped away, I'm taking a look at another document or another set of research that I have often referred to. That's a book by Richard P. McBrien on the lives of the popes. It's kind of interesting because this guy normally will give a lot of documentation of different events during the lives of these men, but I'm not finding anything either in 496 or in 508 that shows anything having to deal with the popes and the baptism of Clovis.
Well, apparently Catholicism did not feel it was necessary to change their view about Clovis very much because they didn't have a 1500-year anniversary celebration in 2008 rather than 1996, or did they and we just missed it?
Well, they did in 96, I know that. I have no idea, what they did or didn't do in 2008, because at that point I was not paying that careful of attention to what the papacy was doing.
I didn't know they had sent their scholars in to do an analysis of 496 until just now.
I am intrigued because for most of 496, the Pope that was on the throne was the 49th Pope, or the 7th by 7th, according to their count. And he was the first Pope apparently from Africa.
That's interesting.
It seems that Pope had a series of letters that read more like legal briefs than pastoral pronouncements. Most of Europe at that time was also under the control of Arian leaders. And the Arian leaders, of course, believed that Christ was not the Son of God, but that he was the greatest of God's creatures.
And we teach that the three horns that were uprooted were Arian.
Right.
So were there other Aryan nations that weren't uprooted? Maybe that's off our, beside the point.
Couldn't answer the question yet.
Yeah. So sorry about
Well,
that interruption. So you guys keep going.
so I was just going to say that the tribe of the Visigoths were considered Aryan, and that's when Clovis drove them out of France. You have then that Bishop of Vienna congratulating Clovis on his baptism and stuff, but he had I think it was part of that is to do with that victory as well. Is sort of tied into that history of driving them Visigoths. So the Visigoths weren't really one of the tribes that we consider were plucked up. They were driven to Spain, but there was maybe eventually they must have had a king then that became Catholic after that. The way I was marking, even the Catholic Church marks Clovis as the first daughter of the Roman Catholic Church or whatever. There's some title that they give to France. So it's sort of like it's marking this as the first kind of king then that's going to do the bidding for the Roman Catholic Church. And then thereafter you have other pagan nations, Aryan nations, which will then, through Clovis's influence, become Roman Catholic.
Yeah, so because the question, is one where, somebody says, well, how come you can mark just paganism goes all the way to 508 when it's already been long in the decline, especially among the populace? I mean, in the sense of them identifying as pagans. They're going to start identifying as some kind of Christian. But if we take the symbol of baptism, would we find that symbol is appropriate to mark that distinction? And why? Why would baptism in 508 be significant prophetically?
Well, it's a death and resurrection, a symbol
Mm-hmm.
that, in a sense, paganism is dying and you're being resurrected, Roman Catholic.
Now we're
And
going to
even
have
the 25th,
yeah.
the 25th of December as well is associated with the death and resurrection. You have the sun,
Yeah.
in a sense, dying and then sort of being reborn as well. That was part of that. Why
Right.
the 25th of December is significant.
Yeah, because it would actually be a pagan date. Right? 508. I mean, or December
Yes.
25th in 508. It's going to be
Yeah.
a pagan date. Now they're going to associate it with the solstice. In that sense, right? So now you have the rising sun, the victory over the dying of the sun. But you also have a number of things. Jesus is baptized at the end of a 30-year period, right? When he's 30 years of age. And you're going to have Clovis baptized at the beginning of a 30-year period. So is that a mirror? Can we connect those two periods of 30 years?
It looks good.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah. So there's lots of reasons why this baptism, if we were going to now make an argument for the death of paganism, that is the paganism being taken out of the way, we know we're going to have Clovis do it because he's the one that's going to remove paganism. But we had always had his conversion 12 years before 508. But now we can place his baptism in 508 on December 25th, on a significant date, and we can tie that date to our line and to lots of other December 25ths that are prophetically significant. And in doing so, we're not going to attack the paganism view of Miller. We're going to affirm it. But many other people will notice this and they will use it to attack the idea of paganism. So they're going to try to save 508. That is, people like Hardy, people like Heidi Hikes. They're gonna hold on to 508, and we're gonna hold on to 508. So in both cases, somebody could look at it and say, well, you're both holding on to a waymark or a landmark, something that is old truth. And you're both going to have a different interpretation of how to mark that date. That is, we're not going to be using the date or the event that Miller chose in both cases. But now we're going to have to argue that we are doing it correctly, but Heidi Hikes and others are doing it incorrectly. And why would that be? Why could we argue that our way of preserving paganism as being the daily is the correct way of doing it, but by rejecting the paganism as being the daily and trying to make it Christ's heavenly ministry. Why is that a rejection of truth, but ours isn't? Because somebody looking at the outside could say, well, you're both doing the same thing. But do we have a good argument of why what we're doing is solid and what they're doing is undermining the foundation? We're shoring up the foundation, they're undermining it. How do we demonstrate that in simple terms? We've already stated it before in other studies on the daily. Anyone?
I really don't know how to state that at this point.
Okay. So if we go back to Daniel chapter 8, we know that there's no basis, if the daily is Christ's heavenly ministry, for the answer to the question, how long shall be the daily, right? How long shall be the vision concerning the daily? If we take the answer is 2,300 days, right? So that's one thing. We know that it undermines the 2,300 days. And then in simple terms, does our understanding make the old truths shine brighter? And does their understanding remove the old truth and see it as darkness? Can we state that? Do you think somebody looking at it, who looks at all the arguments, would say, we are accepting Millerite history and understanding, and they're rejecting it, even though we're doing something that's similar on the surface? We're refining a reason for a date.
I wouldn't disagree with that.
Yeah, that should be our emphasis.
Right. So always new light makes old light shine brighter. It establishes it's going to establish Adventism on a solid footing, more solid footing, than if we take this new argument. Now, the new argument has a point, and that point is they're focused upon Christ's ministry. And you can see how Heidi Hikes in his papers tries to set you up for that, right? He wants you to see that this marvelous thing of Christ's heavenly ministry, but to have it be the daily taken away in 508. He's going to make an argument that this is all about legislation. Now, I don't know really how he can argue that some legislation in 508 remove Christ's heavenly ministry. I mean, really, I don't. I've read his stuff. It's a very, very weak argument. He can give a date for 508 that it has to do with legislative acts, but those legislative acts aren't removing Christ's heavenly ministry. Because if you're going to take the position that Christ's heavenly ministry is removed, what is it that would remove Christ's heavenly ministry if you were going to use that argument? What is it about Catholicism that is going to obscure, in their words, Christ's heavenly ministry? Would it not?
I was going to say they usurp Christ's heavenly ministry.
In what act? In what way do they do that?
But with the Mass.
With the Mass, right? So if you were going to make that argument that it's Christ's heavenly ministry that's obscured, you can't make the argument that it's some legislation in 508, that you're going to pick and choose out of all the different legislative things that occur in that history that has nothing to do with the Mass. Because that's what his argument's going to be, is it's this legislation. But yet, if he's going to think his argument through, you would have the Mass. And when is the Mass going to begin? Does it begin in 508?
Much earlier, I'm guessing around 200.
Well, yeah, it's going to be earlier. Now, of course, it's going to evolve and grow, but it's something that goes right back to the mystery cults of pagan Rome. And so the Catholic Mass, and maybe I can try to find some history on the Mass, but you're not going to place it in 508. And so even on the basis of the type of arguments that they're making regarding paganism, they actually have just as big a problem, maybe even a bigger problem, when it comes to 508. That you can't just argue that 508, because of some legislation, is what obscures Christ's heavenly ministry, because that's the argument he's making. But there's nothing about it. It's just arbitrary on his part. So we're going to see that as we go on and study this. So what I want to do, and Stephen, the study that you have regarding the plucking up of the three kings, do you have that written out in some way that we can look at that?
Not yet. I can arrange that.
Okay.
Maybe next week.
Because I'd like people, for next week, I'd like people to have some of this information, because we need to get this in our minds of when these horns were plucked up, and what kind of events that the Millerites understood that were marked in 508. And so that we have it sorted out, that we're not going to always have to look it up every time. I want to get it sorted out in my mind.
I think Mervyn Maxwell did a lot of research in that in his God Cares 1 and 2 books.
Yeah, well, I'd rather not read Mervyn Maxwell, but I don't have.
He's on the wrong side of the daily.
Yeah, and I don't have his books anyway. So, but yeah, Stephen can get that together for us because he's done a lot of research on that. So anyway, we went a bit over time, but we're going to close with prayer, and we're going to come back at this tomorrow. Okay, let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, we just ask, Lord, that we can continue this study on our own with your Holy Spirit guiding us, that we can come together again and look at these things. We're thankful for the time that you've given us to study, and we ask again that you can be with each person. Help us, Lord, to continue to draw closer to you. And especially as we see December 25th, 2021 approaching for this movement, we pray for this movement that it can be united with a message that it can give to the church. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.